Thank you, Nathan. Okay, so first let me just introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Williamson, and I'm going to be talking today about topology. First off, just any immediate questions before I get started? What? How old do I have? As far as time, we've got one hour exactly. So even with the technical difficulties, we're still only 2 minutes late. Okay. So I've just got a short presentation initially, just kind of talking about some of the details and the boring stuff, but kind of the essential stuff of topology in general. But first off, topology, for those that don't necessarily know, basically refers to the mesh structure of your model. So as far as animation is concerned, it has everything to do with discounting, weight painting, and things like that. It's going to define how well your model animates, how easy your model is to deform, but also not only that, good topology for the advanced modelers have probably found will actually allow you to not only manipulate your model much easier, but also add a lot more details much easier. So that's kind of some of what I'm going to be talking about. But first, let's just go over some of the kind of nitty-gritty details. And many of you that are starting out have probably heard these a lot of tris, quads, and poles. And essentially, basically what we have, the organization here is a little weird because the triangles and quads obviously refer to actual polygons. So you either have 3 vertices that make up a face or 4 vertices that make up a face, whereas a pole is not a face at all. Rather, it is a vertex that has 5 edges, 3 or 5 edges connected to it, essentially. So in terms of how they deal with topology, though, and why they're important to us, because a lot of people starting out will just begin modeling. And before long, before you know it, your model may be an absolute disaster, or it could be clean as can be, depending on either your skill level, your knowledge, whatever it may be. But each one of these things actually has a very big impact on how you model, but also how your model works. So initially, something that we're going to be talking about are edge loops a lot. And edge loops, for those that don't know, are continuous lines of vertices, basically, or a continuous path of edges. And edge loops are essentially everything in topology. I'm not going to talk about them too much in terms of edge loop structure for, say, specific objects such as the human head or a mechanical object or anything like that, as there's plenty of other tutorials out there that already cover this. So instead, what I want to talk about today is basically the theory of topology in terms of kind of general rules of thumb when approaching different kinds of modeling, whether that is hard surface modeling, organic modeling, modeling for sculpting, or low polygon modeling for, say, game development. And each one of these things, such as the triangles, the quads, and the poles, are all going to tie into this very specifically in terms of how they relate to your edge loops. Because edge loops are essentially the main component of topology and the main thing that we're going to be working with. So one by one, the main thing to remember as far as triangles go, general rule of thumb that you'll hear from a lot of people is that if you're modeling, don't use triangles. And you've heard, if you're familiar with my video tutorials from Blender Cookie or Montage Studio, you'll know that I also quote this a lot and am very adamant about trying to get absolutely no triangles in my mesh. But this isn't a solid 100% rule. There are times when triangles are fine. There are times when triangles are very helpful. And so these are basically general rules of thumb that I want to follow when talking about topology. So first on triangles. The main thing to remember is that triangles will always terminate your edge loops. And I'll give you an exact demo of this here in a little bit. But essentially what that means is that if you have a continuous line of vertices, say stretching from, can you still hear me back here if I do that? Yes. Never mind. If you have a continuous line of vertices, say stretching from point A to point B, that forms an edge loop, everything's fine and dandy. But if you have a triangle that uses one of those vertices in the face, that will terminate the edge loop in the sense that if you try and select it, for those that are familiar with alt-right clicking in Blender allows you to select an edge loop, that selection will stop at the triangle. And this is a very easy way to tell that you have basically terminated the edge loop. You've made it discontinuous. And so that's something to remember, that triangles will always do that. Next, they tend to cause pinching if you're using subdivision surfaces. So in addition to my general rule that applies about 90% of the time just not to use triangles, is if you're using subdivision surfaces or multi-res or anything that uses subdivision, try to avoid them at most cost. Next, just like I said, generally should be left out. But we'll talk about this a little further as we go along. Next, we've got basically our quads, and this will be your most common face. It's simply just a face that has 4 vertices. And the main thing is just remember that they don't terminate your edge loops. They're directional in the sense that basically they're going to be what follows your edge loops, or you'll have paths of quads. And they are your best friend because that's what you want to use primarily. But changing pace just a little bit in terms of the actual polygons is the poles. And I'm not going to talk about this too much just yet because I want to really just demo it on actual models to really kind of talk about it a lot. But the main thing to remember is, like triangles, they also terminate your edge loops. So any edge loop that you have going along, if it comes into contact with a pole, it'll stop. One of the benefits to poles, though, is that you can use it to direct your topology. And you just want to be sure to use it sparingly. And we'll talk about this in more detail here in a little bit. But some of you may be thinking, in terms of organization, what about n-gons? Because we have triangles, we have quads, and then we have n-gons. And this is something that many of us don't have access to right now. N-gons are essentially a polygon that can have any number of sides. It could have 5 sides, 6 sides, 20 sides, it doesn't really matter. They're excellent for box modeling and for just kind of roughing out a model, because it allows you to just add vertices, add cuts wherever you want without having to create triangles upon triangles upon triangles, as many of you who have probably tried box modeling in Blender are very familiar with. It's a bit of a hassle. But they can also be a crutch, most definitely, and in general should probably be left out of your final models unless it's perhaps on a flat surface such as an architectural wall. We're not going to be looking at these too much yet. They're primarily just available in the B-Mesh branch, which you can find on Graphical, or you can go ahead and build it from source yourself if you want. Joe Eager, apologies if you're even in the room. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but he's the main developer for B-Mesh. He's here at the conference. But it's definitely something that we'll look forward to playing with. Again, we're not going to talk about it too much, but what I really want to focus on are our loops, particularly being edge loops and face loops. The details, you can kind of just gloss over them. As long as you have a general idea of what they are, you'll be good to go. But really the main thing to remember is that a loop is nothing more than a continuous line or path of edges that will define your shape essentially. So in the case of organic modeling, you'll have all of your organic topology. You'll have all of your edge flow, such as your individual edge loops and your face loops, which are nothing more than 2 parallel sections of edge loops that are then connected by faces. They'll follow all of your individual forms, your muscle contours, and really here in particular is where quads and such are more important than ever. You'll notice in some of the areas around here, we have the continuous, I can just use my mouse. Oh, I guess I can't. Never mind. Okay. So again, you can kind of see in these 2 examples how even though they're very different, they all have continuous sections of edge loops and face loops that follow all the details. This is particularly relevant in all of the folds in the cloth, the shapes in the face. So this is how you can kind of define and determine where you want your edge loops to be. So the general rule of thumb that I like to follow is that when you're placing your edge loops in the beginning, which is something that people really struggle with starting out, where do you place your edge loops? How do you know where they should be? And this is something that is actually, I feel, a lot easier than initially thought, simply because if you can think of how your structure is formed, say, for example, if Well, name something. Name any object, whether it's hard surface, organic, or what?
Flower.
A flower? Okay, so if you're modeling a flower, you've got to think about, well, how are we going to structure these edge loops? How are we going to allow the topology to not only help us in the case of animation, which is where it's generally taught that topology is important, but what about in the case of making the detail flow better, or making your subdivision surfaces if you're using a subsurf modifier, or sculpting? How can you make use of your edge loops in your topology to not only create a better model, but create a model that's more easily deformed, manipulated, or even add detail to? And the main thing to do with this, if you want to easily add detail, you've got to think basically strictly quads. Or quads with an occasional pole, or if, as long as you know what you're doing, a triangle thrown in. And the reason that I say this is knowing what does and does not terminate an edge loop is actually very, very important and can really push your model along. Simply because if you know how to terminate something, or basically how to tell, say, an edge loop, if you're using, for example, the loop cut tool via Control-R in Blender, you'll know that you can cut through a path of faces. But what if you only want to cut through a single section and you want to be sure that maybe all the detail will focus in this one area? Well, if you place your topology right, you can completely control where those paths will go. And since things like loop cuts and such are such a commonplace thing when adding detail, you can kind of, what I like to say is model in advance. So you set up your model not only with good topology and good shape and proportion and things like that, but think about your topology when you're modeling before you even add it. So in the case of the flower, if we want to model, say, the center of the flower and then the petals coming out of it, we want to think about, well, not only when we add in our initial mesh, whether it's a cube that's in subsurfed, or if we add in a sphere or a circle, we don't want to just begin extruding things randomly wherever it just works. We want to think about, well, if I need to extrude petals from this central surface, then I need to be able to set up the correct number of edge loops for that petals. And so it's not so much knowing where to add them, it's knowing kind of when to add them and where you're going to need them, so much as, immediately where you need them. And we can particularly see this in hard surface topology. For example, you'll see in these various areas in this import carbine that I'm working on, which is not finished, which is why you only see this section. The rest of it's not done. We have these holes that are cut into the surface. Well, when I add in this mesh, which is actually just an array modifier, so the mesh is only from here to here, and it's just repeated on, I need to know that, well, if I want to extrude a hole in here, I need to have the correct number of edge loops that are going to create a nice circular surface when I subdivide it. So if I have an edge loop here, an edge loop here, well, I can say, well, okay, I'm going to need one in the middle, go in each direction, just like that, fine. But if you've worked with modeling a lot and subdivision surfaces and such, you'll know that even though a square will subdivide and smooth out to mostly circular, it's not quite there. And so we can quickly just say, okay, before I even worry about extruding the circle, I'll just throw in a couple more. Throw in 3 and 3. Well, this is all very, very simple in terms of knowing what to do. But also what you want to think about, you'll also notice that there's an extra face loop in between each one of these. And I could have, if I just made this plane, well, I know that I'm going to repeat this circle, well, I'll just extrude the entire thing in. But what you'll find is that you're going to create a lot of extra deformation that you don't want, or a lot of kind of distortion in your surface. And the reason that I'm talking about this is not so much, I don't want to tell you how to model an import carbine, or how to cut a hole in a surface, but instead, it's about thinking about your topology and what you're doing in advance before you do it, so that you can actually create a more accurate and more easily manipulated model. So knowing that if I'm going to cut holes in the surface, knowing that if I add in an extra face loop in between them, that I'll get much smoother deformation, then I want to be sure to add those face loops in before I even get close to cutting the hole. And that applies to basically everything when you're modeling or doing topology. Know where you're going with your model. And this is something that kind of goes away from the common practice of sketching and such, where just throw out a whole bunch of things and find something that works. You know, particularly if you watched David's workshop right now, just a little while ago, which was astounding. You know that he likes to refer to his technique of chaos, where he just throws out a whole bunch of things and then finds something that starts to work and goes from there. You can't really do that when you're working with topology. Now, that's not to say that if that workflow works great for you, don't do it, because that's where something like sculpting comes in really well. If you like that workflow, use sculpting. But when you're talking about the actual model, when it's really important how your topology flows, you want to be sure that you have a really clean structure and you're able to work with it. If you like the chaotic structure, which, I mean, as far as I know, when I sketch or if I sculpt, I use that exact same technique. But when you model, the more precise you can be early on, the more precise you'll be later on as well. And what you'll find, a lot of it too, is strictly practice. You know, it's just a matter of knowing what you're going to need to do. So part of it really, if you just observe an object, say, for example, my Wacom pen, or actually a better example that you can actually see would be this bottle of water. If we want to model this, you can extrude this from a circle pretty easily. Well, but what about adding in the detail around the bottom? Sure, you can just kind of scale in the vertices and whatnot, but if you just examine this before you ever touch Blender and just look at it and say, where would I need the topology? How many vertices would I need in there? And where could I place things? An even better example would be this. How can I model this in my head without ever knowing or without ever touching Blender? And so things that you can think about are, for example, a little hard since I can't set down the mic, is where we have things like these pieces forming. Know that you're going to need different topology than just a single circle right in there. You maybe need to put a pole right in here to direct your topology down and through. And so I'll show you some actual examples of this here in just a second. But really what I'm getting at is one of the important steps to being good with topology and knowing kind of what to do is thinking about it in advance. What are you doing beforehand to kind of plan out your topology? Because something that you'll find is if you don't plan it out, you're going to end up with a mess probably. And while, yes, you can clean that mess up, no problem, we've all done our fair share of mesh cleaning. But what if you didn't have to clean up the mesh? What if you just planned it ahead such that you do very little tweaking and you let the rest of the time where you would be cleaning up your mesh instead focused on tweaking your mesh to make an even better model? And so if you kind of think about some of the, I don't want to say rules of topology, just because it's going to vary between users. I know between myself, Bassam, or Jason Van Gumster, we all have different rules in terms of what we like to follow with topology and such. I know Bassam, for one, hates poles. But I'm not going to call them rules because nothing is dead set in topology. A large part of it is what works for you and what works for what you're doing. Obviously, they're a little more dead set if you're talking about animation just because you need it to deform cleanly. But just be aware, you want to keep things really clean and good and follow the general rules of thumb for the most part, but don't be afraid to stray away from them to find out what works. Just know that there's a good chance you'll be coming right back to them. So pretty much the last thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of, before I get to some actual examples, is just the differences between organic modeling topology, hard surface modeling topology, and topology for sculpting. Like you probably saw some of the bullet points, which you'll notice that I'm kind of ignoring, partially because I forget about them. Some of them just kind of detail some things to keep in mind when you're doing those kinds of modeling. So for organic modeling, you want to be sure that your edge flow, particularly individual face loops and such, follow your different contours of your surface. For hard surface modeling, you want to try and outline everything with an individual face loop. So you've got faces outlining all your major details. For topology sculpting, very simple forms, quads only. This is one case where I will say absolutely no triangles. The main thing being, when you subdivide a triangle many times, you're going to cause pinching, basically, and you'll find that it's nearly impossible to sculpt cleanly on it. And also, when you're working in very simple forms, there's no reason to have triangles. You should be able to get those edge loops in there to create strictly quads. And then the other thing to remember is even distribution. In order to get things to subdivide cleanly, you want everything to be evenly distributed. You'll notice in the example here that all of the faces are roughly the same size. They don't have to be exact, but you want them roughly the same size. So you don't want any really long stretched faces or any really short squashed faces. You want to try and keep things mostly even and mostly square in proportion. Now, that's not to say that everything has to be evenly proportioned across the entire model. If you know you're going to need extra detail around the face, throw in some extra loops. The main thing to remember is that all of the faces are roughly square and that they're in generally even distribution and proportion to the faces around them. So, let's talk about, and the last one was low poly sculpting, which is very similar to sculpting, or low poly topology, excuse me. It's very similar to sculpting topology, depending on what you're considering low poly, which of course depends exclusively on your project. You know, if you're doing something for the Unreal 3 engine, you're probably going to have something that's quite a bit higher than this. If you're doing something for, say, Quake 3, you're going to have something that's even lower than this. So that's completely dependent on the project. But with low poly topology, this is a case where even though you want things mostly evenly distributed, mostly square, it is okay to have the occasional triangle. It is okay to have things like that, or some different things squashed. You'll notice I've got a triangle here, some triangles here, and even though those aren't necessary there, they do kind of serve a purpose. Something that happens here, and well, actually, I don't know why that one's there, but it really should be here, is that you can kind of let these things act as hinges in your mesh. Or you'll notice along the ridges along the back of his head, I have the triangles right in here. And it's simply because since you're not having any subdivision surfaces with your low poly model, it's okay to have triangles. That doesn't mean you should go triangle crazy. I like to say that even if you're working with a mesh that's okay to have triangles, and it's okay to do these things, still use them sparingly, simply because working towards a quad-only mesh is good practice. If you know how to remove triangles, you can also know how to put them in correctly. Really, triangles are a problem when they're used incorrectly. They do have their time and place. So let's look at some actual examples. Now we'll say, if you have any specific requests for topology, or in terms of, how would you do this topology, or how do you direct this edge flow, feel free to raise your hand. I've just set up a series of files that I've got that I'm going to work with, that I've kind of prepared in advance, that have varying levels of topology and different kinds of details. But I'm not dead set on showing any one of these or all of them at all. So, real quick, does anybody have any specific topology problems?
What about ears?
Ears?
Yeah.
You had to bring that one up. Okay, so the one example that I have here with ears is unfortunately a pretty bad one as far as the ears go. Now, that being said, with ears are actually a lot of fun.
Says you.
I'm a topology snob, what can I say? I enjoy it. Okay, here we go. Can you hear me? So with this one, kind of joking because the ear on this model is the one area that I didn't really want to show, but that's all right. The main thing to think about with ears, let me just kind of isolate this a little bit. Okay. So, we have our ear. Something that you'll notice in the ear is that we have a lot of different shapes. If you look at your neighbor's ear, look at your own ear in the mirror, you notice you've got a lot of different shapes. Had to make someone feel awkward. You have a lot of different shapes that are kind of weaving in and out. And so the ear, in all its difficulty, is actually the perfect topology exercise. if you want to really master topology, at least as far as organic topology is concerned, but even hard surface topology in a way, simply because you've got to talk about control and such, the ear is a great thing to look at because of all the different shapes. And so the main rule that I mentioned as far as organic topology is concerned is to follow the shapes with your edge loops. And I should say face loops with this, actually, because what you can see, you'll notice if I select some of these face loops, they're following all the main contours of the mesh. Same thing here. And so if you just follow all the contours and then find some way in hell to connect all of those edges, chances are you'll actually end up with something that's semi-decent. So let's actually, since we're talking about ears, let's just do one from scratch real quick. And it won't necessarily be accurate simply because I'm not going to be using a reference. But what we're going to do, if you're a box modeler, more power to you. Personally, I like to model edge by edge. As many of you, if you've seen my video tutorials, you know that I tend to do this with most everything. I like box modeling for some things, but I find that as far as topology is concerned, edge by edge is a much more feasible example and gives you much more control because you've got absolute control over what you're doing. So what I like to do, and we'll just scale this down just a little bit. So if we're talking about the ear, well, the first thing that we want to do is outline the major shapes. So let's talk about the outside of the ear first. If we want to do that, well, we'll just quickly extrude this along. Maybe I'll resize some of this. Okay, so I have my face loop for the primary outside of the ear. And you'll notice I'm trying to keep things nicely, evenly spaced. And what I want to think about is not only how is my mesh going to be structured, but I also want to think about the forms. So I know that if this is the outside ridge of your ear right through here, it's going to kind of follow and come down right to the inside of the ridge right in here. And so I'm just going to go ahead and stop that edge loop right there right now because I don't know how this is going to connect. So let's go ahead and do the next section. So if I want to do, say, this inside ridge right in here, well, let's just grab this edge right here, and I'm just going to extrude it up. Maybe I'll rotate it, extrude again. And I can say, okay, well, that fits pretty well if this is the, is it the targus? I think it's the targus. I don't know. That area right in there, well, that's going to be about right. And I'm not really worried about proportions or anything right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and model this. And you'll notice that I'm also doing everything strictly from the side view, so it's completely flat right now. I can create the depth and the form anytime really easily. So let's just quickly extrude this ridge. And I know that it's going to come out to about right here where you have this kind of inner fold right in this area. And so this kind of defines that inside edge. But I also know that this ridge continues on up through here. Well, how am I going to go ahead and connect this? Well, this is a prime time to use what I generally refer to as diamonds, or basically a rotated quad. And you'll see exactly what I mean here in just a second. So let's just take this out, and I'll maybe bring it out to right about here. And so this is going to basically be the outside ridge of or the outside edge of that ridge that I want. But you'll notice if you look at somebody's ear, that ridge kind of fades into this loop right here. Well, then let's just fill that there. And so what this does, it's two things. One, it creates the diamond of sorts that I've been talking about. You see we got this kind of diamond shape going on, but also creates a pole. In this case, a three-sided pole that we have right here. And these are the things that you want to be careful of because you don't want these just spread all throughout your model, you know, whether they're three-sided or five-sided, because they're not going to deform very well. And I think this is probably where Bassam's hate of poles comes from, because being an animator, he hates them. But if you know where to place them, you can also avoid the bad deformation of them. And I agree. I hate poles if they're badly placed. I hate triangles if they're badly placed. But each one of these things has their time and place. And in this case, we're talking about part of the ear that's not really deforming. You know, I mean, unless you've got somebody going in and bending your ear around, you're probably okay. So this is our basic structure right here. And you'll notice that that's actually the majority of the structure of the ear. So now what we want to do is just start filling things in. And like I said, if you just first think about the structure of your object and the details that you're trying to accomplish. Number one, how much detail are you trying to throw in? Are you trying to create an absolutely realistic ear, by modeling by hand, which is a great exercise, by the way, and I encourage you all to do it, as miserable as it may seem. Once you get used to it, ears are actually kind of fun. So what we can do is we now have all of our main forms laid out. We have the outside of the ear and the main structure of the inside of the ear. So let's just start connecting things. Well, we know that this shape right in here is going to kind of blend in right here and then meet up with this ridge. So let's just connect those faces right there. So just select all 4 vertices, hit F. I also know that these ones up here are going to kind of blend in. And so I can kind of adjust some of my topology to line them up. You'll notice that I try to line up all of my vertices and my edges so that they connect with roughly straight lines in accordance to the edges nearby. And this just helps lend a cleaner mesh. This way I don't have to worry about adding in all the topology and then trying to clean up an absolute disaster. I just keep it nice and clean as I go. And so I can see, if I want to connect this area in here, well, I need to add in another edge loop right there with just Control R, place it, move it up just a little bit to keep it nice and even, and fill this. And something that I want to remember is that if I'm going to add the fold right in here, I need to be sure to keep a nice edge or face loop through this area and on down through here. And so I want to be sure that I'm following that the entire time, because this surface right here defines the outside edge of that shape. But if I want to create the ridge underneath it, I'm going to let this face loop right here define that. So I want to keep that in mind as I'm going in terms of where it's going to be created. So I can go ahead and do that. First along here, I can just fill that. I can see that this needs to move up there to fill in right there. And then this works well. And I can just fill all of these just like that. And now I could very easily add in an edge loop right there, pull it back, and create that ridge. But I don't want to worry about that just yet because I'm still worried about the rest of the structure. Well, I also know that this is going to blend in pretty much right here, as this shape here is going to go underneath the fold. So I can just go ahead and connect that exactly like that. But I also know that there's kind of a valley right here that I want to form. So what I need to do is bring this face loop around through here. And a good thing to do, if I have this kind of valley, an extra ridge here, if I just follow this face loop along right here and then just kind of add it in right there, I'll be able to create that shape pretty easily. So let's just go ahead and I'll just take this vertex, I'll just extrude out to right there, and I'm going to go ahead and extrude it down one more time just so I've got another edge to make a face, and let's fill that. And then I can go ahead and fill this right here to continue that face loop to see where it's going. Well, okay, this works all fine and dandy, but I need to notice a couple things. One, I now have a triangle right here that I need to get rid of, but I can see that, hey, check it out, I've got this extra vertex down here. So then I can just fill that. But you notice now that I have a triangle right here. And so these are the kinds of things that you run into a lot when you're doing edge-by-edge modeling. I think this is why a lot of people prefer box modeling, is you don't have these kind of issues just pop out at you. But one of the advantages to doing it edge-by-edge is you can lay out all your edge loops, then connect them, and have a really good exercise doing it. Because if you can completely control your topology and say, okay, well, I've got this triangle here, I want to get rid of it. If you know how to get rid of that, you've got much better control of your topology, and you'll have a much easier time creating the topology in the first place. So before I get rid of that, though, let's go and say, well, I really like this shape right in here, because that's going to flow nicely with my topology, goes right through there. So I'm going to say, I want to keep that, which means I want to keep all 4 of these. So instead, I need to fix something right in here. And what I'm going to do is let's just take this and let's just hit V to rip it, and we'll scale it down. We know that we're going to add extra edge loops in there anyway so that we can get the details. And so now very quickly, I can go in and just fill in all of these faces. And I got rid of my triangle. And then we can fill that right there. And so now we've got the majority of the shape of the ear. Well, let's go ahead and work on the targus now. So what I'm going to do, if it's coming down right through here, let's say maybe we want to keep this as kind of the leading towards the ear cavity. So we'll just take this edge right in here, and let's just extrude it down a couple times like that. And maybe eventually it's going to go ahead, we'll bring down a couple more, it'll connect right there. This way, this shape kind of comes in through here. We can see that just by connecting these. And so I like this flow that's coming through because I want this shape right in here along the bottom of the ear to kind of just blend in with the face or else form the earlobe, depending on the kinds of the ear you're working with. You know, if somebody has very low or defined earlobes or if they're attached, it's going to depend, or that'll affect your topology. In this case, we're going to work with a little bit more kind of detached. And so let's go ahead and fill out the rest of the targus. So I'll just extrude this shape out just to get my general form. And I can see that that will create a nice shape right there, which not only does it create the shape of the targus connecting it, but it also allows this to come through right here. But I could also add in another loop there and then pull that out, and it would define that crease that comes through right there. So I'm just working through step by step, looking at the topology and looking at the shapes to kind of see where I want to add things, what I need to do. And let's maybe go ahead. We can see this is going to come through nicely right there.
Could you change your background color for the 3D?
Oh, yeah. We'll just do this. That better?
Yeah, much better.
All right. Okay. As long as I don't go into shading mode. In fact, I'm going to do one more thing. Okay. So what I want to do now is I have this kind of hole right here. Well, I could just extrude those out, but I don't really like that flow because something that I want to try and do is I want to keep the entire ear roughly circular such that this perimeter edge loop connects in on itself to create a full circle. Well, so to do that, I can actually do it pretty easily. One, let's just go ahead and grab this vertex. We'll just extrude it out once by control clicking, and then we'll just fill that right there so that we can quickly see kind of how that's going to work. Well, then all I need to do is find a way to fill in all of these faces. I can first go ahead and say, well, this crease that's coming down right here, it kind of softens out in this area. So let's just go ahead and select this, and we'll just fill that. And then I can say, well, you know, I don't really need extra detail right in here, so we'll just merge these two vertices. And then I just have these two faces left to create. Because right now we have 5 vertices. So we can say, well, let's see. Maybe we'll go ahead and bring this vertex. Oh, no, I'm not going to do that instead. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and disconnect this right there. Which, by disconnecting that, I can quickly just add in an edge loop just through those faces. Allows me to connect that and connect that. And now I have this nice topology through here and through here. And you may notice that it seems a little chaotic. You know, we have this loop that's going through here all nicely, but then all of a sudden it turns back in on itself. But what you notice is that it's a continuous set of faces. And so even though it may look chaotic, it's actually a lot nicer than it actually looks. This one's actually really good because it's just continuous right through there. And maybe we can just say, okay, we'll just fill that like so. Now that's a little messy right now, but I'm not going to worry about it for the time being because we can clean that up as we go. Now, we'll just quickly extrude this in like this, and we can create the area for the ear canal. Well, everything looks fine and dandy when it's flat, but how does it transform to a 3D object? You know, right now we can kind of see there's some ear shapes going on, but let's go ahead and take that into effect. Let's go ahead and just select this face loop, and I'm going to go ahead and deselect these ones right in here, and we'll first pull this out just a little bit. And then maybe I want to leave some of these behind. And so I'll just kind of fade it out. And then maybe I can go ahead and select some of these faces in here. I like to work in face mode when I'm doing this, just because it allows me to work with a large number or more the form rather than the actual vertices. And then I can say, you know, I want this ridge to be a little sharper. That's coming through nicely. I'll go ahead and pull the targus out right there, just like that. And, oh, hey, check it out. I've got an ear. We'll take that. Oh, we're going to select this edge. Let's add some actual depth to it, but I want to deselect this because this is where it's going to connect directly to the face. And so I'll just extrude this back right there, and that'll create the actual depth for the ear. Create the back of the ear, I could just quickly, just very roughly scale it down like this. Maybe add in 2 more loops. Scale it out a bit. Very roughly just create the back of the ear. It's not anatomical or anything like that, but it creates the mesh structure because something that you'll want to do is keep this very circular. One of my goals when I work with faces at least is to try and connect the ear without any poles behind the ear and such. Even though you can throw them in, it's not a problem. But if you can connect them evenly and have it just a perfect edge loop coming out from around the ear and go on back, it's kind of an accomplishment from a modeler's perspective to just say, hey, I made all of it work. But it's also just a good exercise to try and get it all in. So at this point, I can just look at this and say, well, I have an ear. All my topology pretty much works. Maybe I don't like some of the ear areas. Maybe I want to pull this little bit out for this ridge here, but I need an extra loop in there. Well, I could add that, but you'll notice some things right in there where it doesn't work. And so at this point, you have the topology that's clean enough to really work and do anything that you want, and fairly simple and fairly quick. At this point, I may need to do a bit more modeling to make this finalized, or to really get it up to a decent level. But once I have the topology in there that's all nice and clean, it's all quads, I can very easily add in some extra detail pretty much wherever I want it. And if you have some places like this where, say, it's turning back on itself, well, then what you want to do is just isolate your selection. So if I want to just add it right through here, well, let's just take this. Let's go into face mode, hide that, add my edge loop through. I can unhide. Notice I've got the triangles here. But what I can say is, okay, well, if that's creating triangles there, but I still need these details, how do I get rid of that? And even though this isn't an ideal situation, it is a very good exercise. So if I have a triangle here, well, I can probably get rid of that by adding in some extra geometry right in here, in this area. And this is actually very advantageous because I want to add in this extra detail right in here for that small ridge. Well, to do that, sometimes it's easiest just to delete some of your faces. So I'm just going to select these faces. I'll just delete them. I don't care about them for the time being. Maybe I'll pull this up here. And get rid of this. How are we doing on time? Okay. And so I can see, maybe if I want to pull this back through here, add that. I can go ahead and, one thing to do is you can use a pole right in here if you want, or the triangle of sorts to add in or to kind of terminate some of those loops. So then I can merge these again. And then I want to connect this right back in here. And what I might even do is, well, maybe if I want some extra volume in here, I'll just add in an extra edge loop. That connects all the way down through to the ear canal. And then I can just fill that, and I've got all quads again. So, like I said before, the ear is a really good example in this case for doing topology because it forces you to find ways to redirect things. And it is a very daunting task. I know, like starting out, the ear's scary. It really is. You talk about the human face. I'm like, oh, the face is, it's hard, but it's fairly simple. It's straightforward. You just have loops around the mouth, around the nose, around the whole head. Great. The ear is a whole other story. So it is fun, though, once you kind of get the grasp of it. And we've just got like 10 or maybe 10 minutes. We can give Andrew a few minutes to set up. Any last requests or questions or things specific?
Can we see what that looks like in subset?
Yeah. Oh. So you can see, obviously we've got a few problems here, but we could very quickly add in extra loops, smooth out some of these.
It's gone dark again.
Oh, so, and when you have the subsurf, that's also a really good time to kind of see how your topology is working in order to display the model nicely. In here, I wanted to add in another loop to get this fold right through here, and so I needed to go ahead and rework some of the topology in this area to do that. But I can rework it real quickly. This is a pretty ugly year. And then another thing you can do, let's say in this area I want to get more detail. Well, let's just take this whole section right in here. And I can get rid of these faces. And then I'll be ready to go in and connect the rest of those. So now it's sort of starting to come together. So, any last questions? Okay, well that's pretty much it. So just to kind of recap some of the main things to just think about as far as modeling goes. Think about your topology before you actually start modeling. Just know that your topology is not the after effect of your model. It's not just what happens when your model's done. It's how you construct your model and what you do to actually make your model workable. Because if your topology is done right, particularly with characters, but with everything, it'll not only be easier to animate, it'll be easier to deform, and in particular, as far as modelers are concerned, it'll be way easier to add in your detail. Particularly with hard surface modeling, if you don't consider where your topology is or kind of how you can work with it, adding in your detail, whether it's adding in ridges to to armor for the arm, or whatever your detail may be, if your topology is just kind of waving every way and out and it's just an absolute disaster, it's not going to work. So ideally, even though you won't necessarily for the final model, in the case of, say, a piece of armor, you should be able to add in all the detail in the topology in a single mesh, even if you have multiple interlocking pieces. Even though the final model, in order to work with it well, animate it well, you should probably go ahead and separate it out. Maybe you've got the piece here, you've got the piece here, then you've got the leather in between the two. But you should be able to create it all with a single, clean topological model as a good exercise, but also just in terms of how the mesh is actually structured. Just because you have different pieces in your model doesn't mean that you can kind of just be lazy about it and just ignore the topology. If you know what you're doing with the topology, by all means, be lazy. But before you be lazy, know what you're doing in the topology. So that's it.